I'll never forget the day my world fell apart. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was sitting in the hospital, staring at my little girl, Angie, hooked up to a dozen machines. She looked so small and fragile, but she was my everything. The doctors told me she needed a kidney transplant, and fast. I'd already offered mine, but I wasn't a match. Maria was supposed to help. She was Angie's mother, after all. But I hadn't seen much of Maria in years. Her priorities had always been complicated. Maria and I had been separated for a while. Angie was the glue that had kept us tied together even after our marriage fell apart. I'd hoped that Maria would step up for Angie, that some maternal instinct would kick in. When she finally showed up at the hospital, though, it wasn't to offer her kidney. It was to demand money. "I'll help Angie," Maria had said, her arms crossed, voice cold. "But I need something in return. I can't just give my kidney for free." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't even respond. "You're her mother," I finally said, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "How could you even think about putting a price on this?" Maria just shrugged, her gaze darting away from mine. "I have my own life to think about. And besides, you've got money, don't you? Use it. If you want me to help, it's going to cost you." It wasn't just the demand for money that crushed me, it was the casual indifference in her tone, like Angie's life was just a bargaining chip in her twisted game. That's when I started to see Maria for who she really was. I always knew she had a selfish streak, but this was something else entirely. I'd barely managed to pull myself together when Maria left the hospital, promising to think about it. I didn't believe her for a second. Later that night, I started digging into her recent activities, desperate to understand how she could be so heartless. That's when I found out about David. David, her lover. The man she'd been sneaking around with while Angie and I were fighting for our lives. They'd been living it up, spending money like it grew on trees, while Angie was in and out of the ICU. Worse, it looked like David had his own plans to benefit from Maria's connection to me. Plans that didn't include Angie's well-being. As I pieced it all together, the anger inside me boiled over. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something darker, something I couldn't let stand. I wasn't going to let Angie suffer because of Maria's greed and David's schemes. They'd both underestimated me. They didn't realize just how far I was willing to go to protect my daughter. Looking back, that was the moment I made my choice. I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Maria and David were not going to walk away from this unscathed. Maria had always been good at twisting things to her advantage. After our confrontation at the hospital, she started playing the victim, like she was the one being wronged. She called me a few days later, claiming she needed time to process everything. I knew better. She was stalling, probably waiting for me to cave and pay her off. "You don't understand what I'm going through, Edward," she said over the phone, her voice dripping with fake emotion. "This isn't easy for me. I have a life too, you know." I clenched the phone so hard I thought it might break. "Angie is dying, Maria. You think I care about your life right now? She's your daughter." Her sigh on the other end was long and exaggerated, the kind of sound she used to make when she wanted to make me feel like I was the unreasonable one. "I said I'd think about it, didn't I? But you're not exactly making it easy for me. Do you have any idea how hard this is?" The conversation ended with Maria hanging up, but her words stuck with me. She had no intention of helping. If anything, she was trying to get more leverage. I could see her clearly now, every lie, every manipulation, and it infuriated me. I needed answers, so I started looking deeper into Maria's life. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet who could find out what she'd been up to. It didn't take long to get results. Within a week, I had a manila envelope in my hands filled with photographs, receipts, and emails that painted a vivid picture of her betrayal. The photos showed Maria and David together at expensive restaurants, staying in luxury hotels, and even shopping for high-end watches and jewelry. The receipts backed it up. Thousands of dollars spent on things Angie would never see. But the worst part. The emails. Maria had been talking to David about securing a payout from me, using Angie's condition as the hook. They were scheming to drain me dry, all while pretending to care about our daughter. When I confronted Maria with the evidence, she didn't even try to deny it. She laughed. Actually laughed. "You had me followed? Really, Edward? How pathetic are you?" she sneered, crossing her arms. "So what? David and I are together. Get over it. And as for the money, well, you can afford it. You should be thanking me for even considering giving Angie my kidney." I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. She's your daughter, Maria. Do you even hear yourself? She's your daughter too, she shot back, her tone icy. If you care so much, figure it out yourself. But don't pretend you're some saint. You were never there for me. David understands me in a way you never could. Her words stung, but not because they were true, because they were so far from the truth. I'd spent years trying to make our family work, sacrificing my own happiness to keep us together. And now, the woman I'd once loved was standing in front of me, unapologetic for betraying me, unapologetic for using our daughter as a bargaining chip. That night, I sat alone in my living room, staring at Angie's picture on the mantel. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve any of it. Maria's lies had gone too far, and I was done trying to reason with her. If she thought she could manipulate me into submission, she had another thing coming. I wasn't just going to fight for Angie's life. I was going to make sure Maria and David paid for every ounce of pain they'd caused. I couldn't shake the weight of what I had uncovered. Every photograph, every receipt, every email felt like a knife twisting deeper. Maria had always been selfish, but this wasn't just selfishness. This was cruelty. She had no shame about her betrayal, no hesitation in exploiting Angie's illness for her own gain. That realization changed something in me. I stopped hoping for her to do the right thing. I stopped expecting her to be a mother, a partner, or even a decent human being. I knew now that the only person who could save Angie was me. For the next few days, I poured all my energy into figuring out what to do. Angie was getting worse. Her doctors said time was running out, and the chances of finding a compatible kidney donor were slim. I couldn't sit back and wait for a miracle. The idea of relying on Maria disgusted me, but I kept running into the same brutal reality. She was Angie's best chance. And Maria knew it. That's why she thought she had all the power. But Maria underestimated how far I was willing to go. I wasn't going to beg her. I wasn't going to play her games. Instead, I decided to take control. If Maria wanted to treat this like a transaction, fine. I would treat it like a war. And wars aren't won by playing fair. I started by digging deeper into Maria and David's lives. The private investigator had already done good work, but I needed more. I needed leverage. I spent sleepless nights combing through every scrap of information I could find. Bank statements, social media posts, even old connections from when Maria and I were still together. What I found was worse than I expected. David wasn't just Maria's lover. He was a conman. He'd been involved in several shady business ventures, leaving a trail of lawsuits and unpaid debts behind him. And now he was using Maria to bankroll his lifestyle, stringing her along with promises of a future that would never come. The more I learned, the clearer it became. Maria and David weren't just hurting me, they were a threat to Angie's survival. If I didn't stop them, they would bleed me dry and leave Angie with nothing. That thought fueled me, driving me to take steps I never thought I'd take. One night, as I was reviewing the investigator's latest report, I came across a name I hadn't seen in years. Santiago. We'd crossed paths once, back when I was desperate to save my business from collapsing. Santiago had a reputation. Some called him a fixer, others called him a criminal, but everyone agreed on one thing. He got results. I never thought I'd need someone like him again, but as I stared at Angie's photograph on the wall, I knew I didn't have a choice. Reaching out to Santiago wasn't easy. He didn't advertise his services, and most people were too afraid to even mention his name. But I had connections, and after a few tense conversations, I managed to set up a meeting. It felt surreal, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, waiting for a man who was more myth than reality. When he finally arrived, he was nothing like I'd expected. He was calm, almost polite, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made it clear he was not someone to cross. I told him everything. About Angie, about Maria, about David. I didn't hold back. Santiago listened quietly, occasionally nodding, but his expression gave nothing away. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. Then he told me what it would take to fix this. His price was steep. Not just in money but in the moral cost of what he was suggesting. But I didn't flinch. Angie's life was worth more than my conscience. As I walked out of the restaurant that night, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. I was stepping into a world I barely understood, but it didn't matter. Maria and David had left me no other choice. They thought they could use Angie's illness as a weapon against me, but they were about to learn just how far I was willing to go to protect my daughter. There was no turning back now. The meeting with Santiago was a turning point. I didn't sleep that night. My mind churned with the weight of what I had agreed to and the grim realization of the lengths I was willing to go. Santiago had made everything clear. There would be no room for hesitation or second-guessing. Once the wheels were in motion, there would be no stopping them. Santiago had earned his nickname, the Soup Maker, for reasons I didn't want to think about too deeply. He wasn't just a fixer. He was someone who erased problems. Permanently. And while I had no intention of taking things that far, I needed his expertise to expose Maria and David for what they truly were. More importantly, I needed him to secure the impossible. 2 kidneys for Angie, no matter what it took. Santiago's plan was methodical and ruthless. First, he would dismantle Maria and David's facade, making their lies and schemes impossible to hide. He called it stripping the mask, a process designed to destroy their credibility and leave them vulnerable. Then, he would move on to the second phase, ensuring Angie's survival by acquiring what she needed, regardless of how unconventional the methods were. The first step was surveillance. Santiago's team began tracking Maria and David, collecting everything: where they went, who they met, what they spent. It didn't take long for their dirty laundry to pile up. David's debts were worse than I'd imagined, and Maria had been funneling money to him for months. They were living in a fantasy, completely blind to the storm heading their way. The next step was exposure. Santiago knew that public disgrace would cripple them faster than any legal battle. He had a way of leaking information strategically, making sure it landed in the hands of the right people at the worst possible moments. Within days, rumors began swirling about Maria and David's behavior. David's creditors started showing up, demanding payment. Maria's friends and acquaintances, people who had always admired her polished exterior, began to distance themselves. I watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. On the one hand, I felt vindicated seeing them face the consequences of their actions. But on the other, I couldn't ignore the growing darkness inside me. I was no longer just a father fighting for his daughter. I was a man willing to do whatever it took, even if it meant stepping into the shadows. Santiago's influence extended far beyond Maria and David. When I first mentioned Angie's need for kidneys, I hadn't expected him to take it as a personal challenge. But Santiago didn't do things halfway. He told me, in his calm and deliberate way, that he had connections, people who could make things happen where the usual channels failed. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I knew better than to dig into details that could haunt me later. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself torn between 2 worlds. At the hospital, I was the devoted father, sitting by Angie's bedside, holding her hand, and reading her stories to keep her spirits up. But outside those walls, I was someone else entirely. A man consumed by a mission that blurred the line between right and wrong. One evening, as I sat in the hospital cafeteria, Santiago called with an update. His voice was as steady as ever, but there was an edge of finality to his words. The kidneys had been secured. He didn't explain how, and I didn't press him. All I cared about was that Angie would have a chance to live. The cost, both financial and moral, would weigh on me later, but for now, it was a price I was willing to pay. Maria and David, meanwhile, were unraveling. David had started avoiding Maria, his loyalty evaporating the moment their troubles became too public to ignore. Maria, true to form, doubled down on her lies, spinning new stories to try and salvage what little reputation she had left. But Santiago's reach was far greater than her imagination. Every lie she told was countered with cold, hard evidence, leaving her no room to maneuver. By the time I walked into the hospital to inform Angie's doctors about the donor match, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Maria and David anymore. This was about protecting Angie's future, no matter the cost. Santiago had set the stage, and now it was my turn to ensure that Maria and David were no longer a part of our lives. For good. The wheels were spinning faster than I could keep up, but that was Santiago's style. Precise, relentless, and impossible to stop once set into motion. Maria and David had no idea what was coming. Santiago had made sure of that. He was deliberate in how he delivered each blow, orchestrating their downfall with the precision of a surgeon. The first cracks started to show when David's business ventures began collapsing. Santiago's team uncovered not only his unpaid debts but also a string of fraudulent dealings that stretched back years. Creditors and former associates began closing in, demanding answers and payment. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized. Even Maria, who had been funneling her own ill-gotten money into David's schemes, found herself caught in the fallout. She'd been reckless, leaving a paper trail Santiago could follow with ease. Next came the public exposure. Santiago wasn't just dismantling their finances, he was going after their reputations. Carefully curated leaks made their way into the hands of people who mattered. Pictures of their extravagant outings, proof of their exploitation of Angie's illness, and even snippets of Maria's brazen emails to David were distributed like wildfire. Maria had spent years cultivating an image of charm and sophistication, but now, that facade was crumbling. People she once called friends were quick to distance themselves, afraid to be associated with the mess she'd created. David, true to form, proved to be a coward. As the pressure mounted, he turned on Maria, blaming her for everything. Their so-called partnership unraveled in a matter of days, leaving Maria scrambling to defend herself. She tried reaching out to me again, this time with a tone of desperation. She claimed she was willing to help Angie, but only if I would make all of this go away. I ignored her pleas. She was still trying to negotiate, still trying to manipulate me, even when her world was burning around her. Angie, meanwhile, was holding on. The doctors had scheduled her transplant, and though I should have felt relief, all I could think about was how far I had gone to make it happen. The 2 kidneys Santiago had procured were a miracle in the medical sense, but I knew better than to believe they came without a cost. I didn't ask where they had come from. I couldn't. It was one of the unspoken rules Santiago had laid out when we first met. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. And I didn't. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't afford to falter now. Angie's life depended on me staying focused. With the transplant approaching, I shifted my attention to securing Angie's future. I wanted Maria and David out of our lives for good. Santiago assured me that was already in progress. He was orchestrating their final act, though he was deliberately vague about what that entailed. All he would say was that Maria would disappear, and that David would no longer be a concern. Despite his cryptic words, I trusted Santiago to follow through. He was meticulous, never leaving loose ends. I didn't need to know the details. I only needed to know that Angie and I would finally be free of them. The day the surgery was scheduled, I sat by Angie's bedside, holding her hand as the nurses prepped her for the procedure. She was so brave, smiling up at me despite the fear in her eyes. I told her everything was going to be okay, that she was going to feel so much better soon. And for the first time in weeks, I believed it. As they wheeled her into the operating room, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't over yet, but the worst was behind us. Maria and David were nothing more than shadows now, their influence fading into the background. Santiago had kept his promise, and Angie was finally getting the chance she deserved. But as I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by the sterile hum of the hospital, I couldn't help but wonder about the cost. Not just the financial toll, though that was substantial, but the moral price I had paid. I had stepped into a darkness I never thought I'd enter, all for the sake of my daughter. And while I didn't regret it, I knew it had changed me. Angie's life was worth it. Every sleepless night, every compromise, every step down the path Santiago had laid out, it was all worth it. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come, that the final chapter hadn't yet been written. Maria and David were out of our lives, but their shadows lingered, a reminder of everything I had sacrificed to protect what mattered most. Maria's disappearance was almost poetic in its suddenness. One moment, she was still trying to claw her way back into control, leaving voicemails and sending emails filled with empty threats and half-hearted apologies. The next, she was simply gone. No one knew where she had gone, or at least no one who would admit to it. Santiago's methods were thorough. He had warned me this would happen, that Maria's presence in our lives would become a thing of the past. And he was right. David's downfall, on the other hand, was far more public. Santiago had made sure of that. The man who once strutted around like a peacock, using Maria's money to fund his extravagant lifestyle, was now a pariah. His debts caught up with him first. Angry creditors began showing up at his door, and when the money ran out, so did his allies. He was forced to sell everything of value, his car, his watch, even the flashy suits he loved so much. But it didn't stop there. The final blow came when Santiago's team leaked documents exposing David's illegal activities. Fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement, it was all there, laid out in undeniable detail. The authorities were quick to act, and David found himself hauled into court, a broken man trying to defend the indefensible. The media had a field day, painting him as the poster boy for greed and corruption. Watching his life unravel from afar, I felt no pity for him. He had brought it all on himself. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had spent so much time trying to take from others, using Maria, using me, and even exploiting Angie's condition. Now, everything he had built on lies and deceit was crumbling before his eyes. Santiago had made sure there was no escape. The name David would only ever be associated with disgrace from that point forward. As for Maria, rumors swirled in her absence. Some said she had fled the country, unable to face the fallout of her actions. Others speculated that she had fallen victim to one of David's enemies. I didn't ask Santiago for details. I didn't want to know. All I cared about was that she was gone, leaving Angie and me free from her manipulations. Santiago's work wasn't without its own dark undertones. The way he had dismantled Maria and David's lives was surgical, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. It wasn't just about removing them from our lives, it was about making an example of them, ensuring they could never pose a threat to anyone again. And while I was grateful for his help, I couldn't ignore the lingering unease I felt whenever I thought about the man who had made it all possible. Angie's surgery, meanwhile, was a success. The doctors were amazed by how well the kidneys matched, marveling at what they called a rare and fortunate find. I didn't share the details of how those kidneys had been secured. That secret was mine to bear alone. All that mattered was that Angie was finally getting better. Watching her smile again, her cheeks rosy and full of life, was enough to push the guilt to the back of my mind, at least for a while. Despite everything, there was still a long road ahead. Angie needed time to recover, and I needed to rebuild the life we had lost. Santiago's work was done, but the consequences of his methods lingered like a shadow. I had won the battle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost a part of myself in the process. Maria and David were gone, but their absence didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, cold, hard, and necessary. Angie was safe now, and that was all that mattered. At least, that's what I told myself as I watched her sleep peacefully, free from the pain that had once consumed her. For the first time in months, our home was quiet. No arguments, no manipulation, no lingering presence of people who didn't deserve to be in our lives. Just Angie and me, starting over. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was one I could live with. The days following Angie's surgery felt like a dream, a fragile, beautiful dream I was terrified of waking from. Her color returned first, her pale skin gaining a healthy glow that I hadn't seen in months. Then came her energy. At first, she could barely sit up on her own, but each day she grew stronger, taking her first wobbly steps around the hospital room with a determination that nearly brought me to tears. She was a fighter, my fighter, and now she finally had a chance. The doctors called it a miracle. They said the match was so perfect that Angie's body had accepted the kidneys without issue. I nodded and thanked them, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been done to make that miracle possible. I didn't regret it, not for a second, but there were nights when the weight of it all pressed down on me. The cost of saving Angie would always linger, a shadow I couldn't fully escape. Maria's absence became a strange, unspoken relief. Angie asked about her once, her small voice tinged with confusion rather than sadness. I told her that her mother had to go away, that she wasn't going to be part of our lives anymore. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Angie accepted it with a quiet nod, her trust in me unwavering. She had been through enough, and I wasn't going to let her carry the burden of Maria's choices. I threw myself into creating a new life for us. The first step was moving out of the house we had shared with Maria. It was too full of memories, too haunted by the past. I found a smaller, cozier place closer to Angie's school and the hospital. It wasn't much, but it was ours, a fresh start in every sense of the word. Angie's recovery became my sole focus. I learned how to manage her medication schedule, how to prepare meals that wouldn't strain her new kidneys, and how to create a sense of normalcy in a world that had been anything but. Her laughter, light and genuine, filled the house again, erasing the echoes of the arguments and betrayals that had once dominated our lives. Despite the progress, I couldn't fully shake the past. Santiago's influence lingered like a ghost, a constant reminder of the lengths I had gone to save my daughter. He kept his distance after the transplant, only checking in once to confirm that everything had gone as planned. I didn't ask him about Maria or David. I didn't want to know. All that mattered was that they were gone, and Angie was safe. One evening, as I watched Angie play with her toys in the living room, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. She was smiling, carefree, her laughter filling the room. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future, a real future, where Angie could grow up without the weight of Maria and David's betrayal hanging over her. I began planning for that future. I spoke to a lawyer about filing for divorce from Maria, citing abandonment. It was a straightforward process, given the circumstances. Maria hadn't made any attempt to contact us since her disappearance, and I had no intention of seeking her out. The paperwork was cathartic, a way to put an official end to a chapter of my life that had been filled with pain and deceit. With the legal process underway, I turned my attention to building a support system for Angie and me. Friends and family who had distanced themselves during the chaos began to reappear, offering help and kindness. Angie, resilient as ever, seemed to thrive in our new environment. She made friends at school, excelled in her classes, and even started talking about joining the soccer team once her doctors gave her the green light. Through it all, I held on to the promise I had made to myself the day Maria walked out of our lives. I would never let anyone or anything hurt Angie again. She was my purpose, my reason for every hard choice I had made, and the light that guided me through the darkest moments. We were moving forward, together. The finality of signing the divorce papers hit harder than I thought it would. It wasn't sadness I felt, it was exhaustion. Years of frustration, betrayal, and bitterness boiled down to a few strokes of a pen. The papers made it official. Maria was no longer my wife. She was just someone I used to know, someone who had left scars so deep they'd never fully fade. I thought about everything that had led to this point, how Maria's lies had unraveled the life we'd built together. There was no regret about ending it. If anything, there was relief. She had chosen her path, one that excluded Angie and me, and I'd chosen mine. The difference was that mine was for Angie, always for Angie. And while Maria was a memory now, Angie was my future. Life slowly began to stabilize. The chaos that Maria and David had brought into our lives faded like a bad dream. Angie's laughter became the soundtrack of our days, and our little house grew into a home filled with warmth and love. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The empty spaces Maria had left behind were filled with small joys, a Saturday spent at the park, an impromptu pizza night, the way Angie's face lit up when she brought home an art project from school. I tried not to think about Maria or David. They were gone in every sense of the word. Santiago had ensured that. And while I couldn't fully reconcile with the darkness of what I'd done to protect Angie, I couldn't bring myself to regret it either. Some nights, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I thought about Santiago's last words to me. You'll never regret protecting your daughter. But you might regret not protecting yourself. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I did. The choices I'd made for Angie had taken a toll on me. I wasn't the same man I'd been before all of this. My moral compass had shifted, bent by the weight of necessity. There was a price to pay for walking into the shadows, and it wasn't one I could simply shrug off. But Angie was worth it. She would always be worth it. As the months turned into years, the past became easier to bear. Angie's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Her doctors marveled at her progress, and I watched with pride as she grew into a vibrant, determined young girl. She joined the soccer team, just like she'd wanted, and I became the dad cheering from the sidelines at every game, my heart swelling with pride every time she scored a goal. But moving on didn't mean forgetting. There were reminders everywhere. Small, subtle things that brought back flashes of what we'd been through. A song Maria used to play on the radio, a certain scent that reminded me of her perfume, even the sound of someone's laugh that was just a little too similar to hers. Each time, I forced myself to push those memories aside. Maria was gone. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. Angie deserved a father who wasn't trapped in the past, and I refused to let the weight of those memories hold me back. One evening, as I tucked Angie into bed, she looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes that always seemed to see right through me. "Dad," she asked, "do you think Mom will ever come back?" The question caught me off guard. It had been years since she last mentioned Maria. I took a deep breath, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I don't know, sweetheart," I admitted. "But what I do know is that we're okay just the way we are. You and me, we're a team, and nothing will ever change that." She seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding. "I like our team," she said with a sleepy smile, curling up under her blanket. "We're the best." I kissed her forehead and turned off the light, my heart heavy but full. Angie had a resilience that humbled me every day. She had endured so much in her young life, but she didn't carry the bitterness or anger that sometimes threatened to consume me. She was my anchor, my reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light worth fighting for. As time went on, I found myself reconnecting with the parts of life I'd neglected during the chaos. Friends who had drifted away began to reappear, and I started allowing myself to dream again. Not just about Angie's future, but about my own. I didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but I was ready to walk it, one step at a time. There were still nights when the past crept in, when the memories of Maria's betrayal and Santiago's shadowy methods haunted me. But they didn't define me. They didn't define Angie. We were more than the sum of our scars. more than the choices we'd been forced to make. In the end, it all came down to Angie. Her laughter, her determination, her boundless capacity for joy, those were the things that mattered. The rest was just noise, a storm we'd weathered together and come out stronger on the other side. Our story wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its darkness. But it was ours, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a future worth fighting for. Whatever came next, I knew we would face it together. And that was enough.